right, so I ended talking about Brazil, and I was like, dang, their African Americans look different than our African Americans. Well, they came from the Portuguese areas, so these ethnicities were different than the ones that we brought over.
You're saying African American.
Yes, people in South America are African Americans also, okay? Yeah, all right. But so you have different ethnicities within Africa. There's 1,000 ethnicities here, and they're not mixing with English, they're mixing with Portuguese. So, like I said, I was like, they look, different. But what was cool was the coaches were all talking to me in Portuguese, like, I'm supposed to understand them. But I didn't. But I was happy that they were actually addressing me in Portuguese, thinking I was smarter than I actually am. All right. So international migration of ethnicities, for the most part, stage 2 demographic transition. We know about Europe going through it in the 1800s, and there's no room, and they're coming to North America, South America, Australia, South Africa. All right, and then we can see more recent places like Asia, Latin America going through stage 2 demographic transition, and their surplus of people are looking for labor. And it's like the helicopter pilot in Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, okay? Remember how bright he was? He did everything, but he came and he was the cameraman for the news service in that movie. All right. Then what you see is, before we get to internal migration, is you see different reasons why people come. They could be refugees fleeing a war. We have a big Vietnamese community in Stockton. They were fleeing in the 1970s. But a big part is African Americans being brought over when they were Africans. They weren't African Americans yet. Their offspring are. All right, they're brought over, as Mr. Hillstrom was talking about. And then we're going to talk about their movement within the United States later in slides. They're basically stuck in the South, first as slave and then as sharecroppers, but they're going to move when there's economic opportunity in World War I and II in the factories of the North and West. All right? And then what happens is you have segregation by choice. People go to their ethnic enclave, but then you also have where the locals will allow them to live, meaning, what houses are sold to them, all right? What houses are financed for them? And you'll see that kind of discrimination going on. Okay, all right. So we're going to talk about, we've talked a lot about slavery forced from Africa, and our slaves are from West Africa, all right? It started, the Portuguese. They were the original slavers. And not only were they doing it on the West Coast, they were doing it on the East Coast, and there were Muslim businessmen involved too, okay? We're not the only bad guys in this. Then the Dutch get in on it, and the English get on it, and it's basically the Western world's wealth is built off of slavery, all right? Not only the sale of them, but the labor to produce a lot of those goods, like sugarcane, okay? And then later cotton in the United States, all right? So you see that Mr. Hillstrom talked a lot about going to South American and the Caribbean, and a very small percentage brought to the United States. So the irony is, if you went to South America or the Caribbean, you had a chance to eventually buy your freedom, if you could do that. Here in North America, our slaves were known as chattel slaves. And basically the word is cattle. We saw them as livestock. We saw them as less than human. Here they saw them as human, but they worked them to death. All right, they died of malaria, they died of heat stroke, but if you survived all of that, then you actually had a chance to be free, but a very small percentage actually achieved that. All right, and let's see, the 1960s on, voluntary to North America from Asian and Latin America. We talked about stage 2 demographic transition, population surplus in those places, and now they're coming, okay? All righty, and here you can see a slave, the deck of a ship. Your last textbook was a lot more graphic. You didn't get to see it, where they would show how they would stack the slaves in these basically shelves down below. Imagine laying for a month in your own waste and your neighbor's waste next to you. You're brought up on the deck and they throw salt water on you. You have open wounds from laying on those wooden shelves and the chains, all right? It's estimated that 1/3 of the slaves died on the way over, all right? Why did they pack them so tight on the ships? Because they were going to lose 1/3 of them. They knew that the weakest ones were going to die off. And you didn't put everybody from the same ethnic group or tribe together because then they could communicate with each other and overthrow the ship's captain. You made sure that those slavers, those dominant ethnicities that were defeating their neighbors and enslaving them, you made sure that you separated them out so that you didn't have too large of a group from one group together to actually overthrow a ship. And there's a great movie about that, The Amistad. Okay, all right. Are you up?
Yep.
Okay.
So in the Amistad, they actually talk about how you could smell the slave ships coming as they came in, and they would never smell the same again. Okay, Mr. Wright was talking about the sort of the inhumanity of the slave system. So in class we talked about how did this work. Okay, so part of this is you have a lot, thousands of different ethnic groups in Africa. And we talked about those ethnic groups would fight over land, over resources, and things like that. So what better way to get rid of your enemy than to raid their tribe, pick out their young men, their strong young men, march them to the coast, which maybe they've never seen the ocean before, put them on a ship, which who knew what a ship was, and then basically send them across the ocean. Great way to get rid of your enemies, right? So for the coastal Africans, that worked well. Now, this is showing us two things. One is showing us that most of the Africans ended up in South America. We talked about that before. So I don't know if this is going to come up on the AP test or not, but if you're wondering, this is where most of the African slaves ended up. Okay, like Mr. Wright said, the Portuguese were sort of the original slavers, and then come the Dutch and the English, and everybody kind of piled on. So the other thing this is showing us is the triangle trade. So remember, this is the 1800s. The Industrial Revolution is taking place in Europe. They're cranking out the cloth like crazy. They're starting to get into guns just a little bit. And they're trading those things. You see cloth and trinkets, okay? But they're trading, eventually it'll be guns that they'll trade with the Africans on the coast. Those things are being traded for slaves and also for gold. Okay, this is the middle passage that goes across the Atlantic Ocean. Like Mr. Wright was saying, that's where they lost about a third of the slaves. I've read things that said that sharks actually changed their migration patterns to follow those slave ships because they knew it was going to be an easy meal. A lot of people got up out from underneath that situation, underneath the boat, and they just jumped. They ended it. Okay, so once they get to the Caribbean, they get offloaded. Some of them stay in the Caribbean, work on sugar plantations and things like that. Most of them go, like we said, to South America. But then from here, they bring up molasses or sugar, and then here in New England, we make the booze, we make the rum, and then the rum heads back over to Great Britain. And so you have what they call the triangular trade. It's more of a rectangle, but you get the idea there. Okay. Oh, example of forced migration, right? Also an example of international migration. Okay. So once the slaves are in the southern part, right, of the United States, they're working on tobacco farms at first, and then cotton fields. Okay. And I'm sure you guys have heard a lot about that in 8th grade history. 13th Amendment happens. Hooray! We're free. Okay. So you, as a freed slave, what kind of skills do you have? You can farm, you know how to work the land, but you really don't have any money, okay? You really don't have any connections, and you have very little resources. So this system of sharecropping springs up in the South. And we talked a lot about this in class, how blacks, freedmen, they called them, former slaves, would go to work for their former masters, and the masters would essentially say, for a share of the crop that you create, you can live on this land, and then you can have a little bit for yourself. Okay. Well, the way that it in reality worked out was that the master owned everything: the seeds, the hoes, all the tools that everyone needed, okay, to grow the crops. And the person would start out in debt, and they would end in debt. Okay, and sometimes some historians say it was a life that was even worse than slavery in a lot of ways because there was just no way out of it. So many African Americans decided that they were going to move north. okay? Because they had some opportunities during World War I and World War II. So during World War I, a lot like what's happening now, where they're converting the factories to make ventilators and stuff like that, they converted the factories up here to make weapons, okay, for World War I. And so when the young men, the usually white young men, left those factories, there were job openings, okay? And so African Americans were moving into cities where there was industry. And then when the white men would come back, okay, the black men were often laid off, they were displaced, okay? And then they were left to find some other type of work. And so cities like Detroit, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Chicago, St. Louis, these are all kind of like industrial cities, industrial hubs where people, where African Americans migrated to during the first Great Migration and the second Great Migration. So it happened during World War II as well. Okay, so once they're displaced, okay, where do you go? What do you do? Okay, Mr. Wright's going to talk a little bit about how the ethnic groups in those areas form ghettos, and they talk and we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide.
Okay, so Baltimore, you guys might have heard in the news a couple of years ago where some disparaging things were said about it. It started out as a factory city, a port city, okay? It's here on the coast, just above Washington, D.C., all right? So during World War I and World War II, factories were built there, ship ports, and there were a lot of jobs available. So African Americans were coming up from the South, taking those jobs, as were other people. You know, if you are a country western fan, there's a lot of songs about that migration, not only of African Americans, but of poor Southern whites. That's when my grandmother left during World War II, coming for jobs. Thank God she came out to California. All right, but Baltimore, you can see that people are living near the factories. At one point, those homes were actually decent middle-class neighborhoods before the factories came. But when the factories came in and there was more traffic, more pollution, the people with means moved out, and they moved out to the suburbs. And you see the people from the South moving in and taking those jobs, poor blacks and poor whites. But then you're going to see neighborhoods grow, get bigger and bigger as more people come. And there's a great book called The Doll Maker, where it's looking at what poor whites went through during this. Not, we always think about what African Americans went through, but The Doll Maker is about a family from Kentucky, and they made a movie out of it with Jane Fonda. Okay, alrighty. Okay, here you see in Detroit. Detroit was a manufacturing hub. We made our cars there. Henry Ford started making cars here, and during World War I and II, it's going to be a big industrial place where we're making our military hardware. And you can see the white population going up, but then when African Americans start coming, remember after World War II, we have freeways, we have cars, people start moving out to the suburbs. Places like Grosse Pointe is the Beverly Hills of Detroit. And then what happens as the car industry dies, you see whites just leaving. Detroit goes from, you better check the time for me. Detroit goes from 2 million people to, we're good?
You got a little over a minute.
Okay, Detroit goes from 2 million people down to 800,000 in a very short time because the jobs are gone. But you can see African Americans have nowhere to go or less opportunity to go. So you can see Detroit now is a very African American city. Okay, we good?
Yeah.
Okay.
You got 1 minute. You want to?
Oh yeah, I can do this. All right, the next few slides, what we're going to talk about. Oh, I touched my face. What would Dr. Fauci say? All right. In the next few slides, we're going to talk about segregation, the difference between our separate but equal in the United States versus a very harsh apartheid in South Africa. Okay, so they're similar, but we're going to look at the subtleties of them and compare and contrast.